Imagine coming home from war. You survived the explosions. You survived the fire. You survived watching your shipmates die right in front of your eyes. You made it back to shore. But something came home with you that nobody could see. Something that woke you up screaming at 3 in the morning. Something that made a car backfiring feel like incoming enemy fire. Something that made the people who loved you most feel like complete strangers. For generations of United States Navy sailors, this was not just a story. This was their life. And for most of American history, nobody had a single word for what they were going through. Today, we know it as post-traumatic stress disorder. But the road from silence and shame to diagnosis and treatment is one of the most powerful, painful, and ultimately hopeful stories in the history of American military medicine. It is a story that stretches from the wooden warships of the Civil War all the way to the cutting-edge treatment centers of today. It is a story of brave men and women who fought 2 wars at once. One against an enemy on the battlefield, and one against the darkness inside their own minds. This is that story. And it needs to be told. Let us go back. Way back. To a time before the term shell shock ever existed. Before PTSD was in any medical textbook. Before anyone in a military uniform was allowed to admit that war had broken something inside of them. The year is 1862. The American Civil War is in full force. And the United States Navy is engaged in some of the most brutal and terrifying combat it has ever seen. Think about what these sailors were experiencing. They were locked inside iron ships, firing massive cannons at close range. The noise alone was enough to permanently damage a man's hearing. The heat inside those vessels reached unbearable levels. Men watched their friends get torn apart by cannon fire just feet away from where they were standing. They smelled burning flesh. They touched wounds that no human being should ever have to touch. And when they came home, they were expected to simply move on. To get back to work. To be grateful they survived. Many of them could not do that. Physicians of the era noted something unusual in veterans returning from naval combat. They described it in clinical language, calling it soldier's heart, or irritable heart. Doctors like Jacob DaCosta observed that veterans were experiencing rapid heartbeats, chest pain, shortness of breath, and extreme anxiety. They could not figure out what was causing it physically. But the symptoms were real. The suffering was real. What they were actually witnessing, though they had no framework to understand it, was psychological trauma manifesting in the body. There was no treatment. There was no support. These men were largely left to manage on their own. Many turned to alcohol. Many became isolated from their families. Many died young, their internal wounds as deadly as any cannonball. This was the beginning of a very long, very difficult chapter in American military history. Now let us fast forward to the early 20th century. The First World War. The age of industrialized killing. This was war on a scale that the world had never seen before. Massive artillery barrages that went on for hours. Days. Sometimes weeks. The ground shook constantly. The air was filled with smoke and poison gas and the sound of explosions that never seemed to stop. For Navy sailors operating in these conditions, the experience was terrifying in ways that were entirely unique to their service. Unlike soldiers in trenches on land, sailors had no place to run. No place to take cover. When your ship was under attack, you were trapped. You fought back or you died. And even when you survived, the psychological cost was enormous. It was during this era that the term shell shock entered the public vocabulary. British military physicians first used it to describe soldiers who had been exposed to repeated artillery explosions and were now exhibiting a range of disturbing symptoms. Tremors. Nightmares. Inability to speak. Paralysis without any physical cause. Extreme emotional sensitivity. Inability to function in everyday life. The initial response from military leadership was, to put it mildly, not compassionate. Many commanding officers viewed shell shock as a form of cowardice. Some men were court-martialed for it. Some were even executed. The prevailing attitude was that a real man, a real soldier, a real sailor, simply would not fall apart like that. If you were struggling psychologically, it meant something was fundamentally wrong with your character. Can you imagine how isolating that must have been? You go through the most terrifying experience of your life. You watch men die. You nearly die yourself. Your mind fractures under the pressure. And then the institution you gave everything to tells you that you are weak. That you are a coward. That you need to get yourself together and stop embarrassing yourself. Thousands of American Navy sailors during the First World War experienced exactly this kind of double betrayal. First by the war itself, and then by the system that should have cared for them. But something was shifting. Slowly. Painfully slowly. But shifting nonetheless. A small number of military physicians were beginning to push back against the idea that psychological trauma was simply a character flaw. They were arguing, with the evidence of thousands of suffering veterans on their side, that what these men were experiencing was a legitimate medical condition. That it was caused by real experiences. That it deserved real treatment. The United States Navy, like all branches of the American military, was in the very early stages of grappling with what to do about this. They established some early psychiatric units during the war. The results were mixed. Treatment was rudimentary. Understanding was limited. But the conversation had started. Then came the Second World War. And everything changed. Everything got worse. And eventually, almost against its own instincts, the military was forced to take psychological trauma seriously. The scale of the Second World War was simply incomprehensible. 50 to 80 million people dead. Combat that spanned every ocean, every continent, nearly every corner of the globe. The United States Navy was at the center of some of the most intense and prolonged combat in human history. The Battle of Midway. Guadalcanal. The island-hopping campaigns across the Pacific. The North Atlantic convoy runs against German submarines. Operation Overlord and the naval support for D-Day. Sailors were living through experiences of relentless, grinding terror. Submarine crews spent weeks at a time underwater, not knowing if they would surface alive. Destroyer-men fought off kamikaze attacks with almost no warning. Carrier pilots flew mission after mission, watching their friends fail to return. The casualty rates in some naval engagements were horrific. During this period, the term used by military psychiatrists was combat fatigue, or sometimes operational exhaustion. The language was still deliberately physical. Still avoiding anything that might imply psychological weakness. But the recognition that combat was producing lasting mental damage was growing. The Navy began implementing psychiatric screening processes before deployment. They established forward psychiatric units closer to combat zones, operating on the principle that men who received early treatment had better outcomes than those who were evacuated all the way back home. This was based partly on the work of psychiatrists like Thomas Salmon, whose ideas about treating soldiers close to the front were gaining traction. There were some remarkable individual stories from this era. Navy psychiatrists working in the Pacific Theater reported seeing sailors who had been through the most intense naval combat imaginable arriving at medical units in states of profound psychological distress. Men who could not sleep, who could not eat, who startled at any sudden sound, who had completely withdrawn from human contact. Some were mute. Some were shaking uncontrollably. Some had simply stopped functioning. The treatments available were still limited. Rest was often prescribed. Sometimes barbiturates were used to help men sleep. There were early forms of what we might now recognize as talk therapy, though the theoretical framework was primitive by modern standards. Some psychiatrists used narcosynthesis, which involved administering sedatives to help patients enter a state where they could talk more freely about their experiences. What is remarkable, looking back, is not the sophistication of the treatments. It is the fact that so many of these psychiatrists genuinely cared about their patients. They were fighting against institutional attitudes that still viewed psychological distress as weakness. They were fighting for recognition that these men deserved care. That their suffering was real. That something could and should be done about it. The numbers tell part of the story. By the end of the Second World War, psychiatric casualties accounted for a significant portion of total military casualties. Some estimates suggest that psychological conditions were responsible for more lost man-hours than all physical wounds combined. The military could no longer pretend that this was a marginal issue. It was a core operational problem. But acknowledgement of the problem and genuine, effective treatment were still very far apart. And then the veterans came home. Millions of them. And for many, the war came home with them. The late 1940s and the 1950s are often remembered as a golden age in America. The economy was booming. Families were moving to the suburbs. The baby boom was in full swing. Everyone was supposed to be happy. Grateful. Moving forward. But behind closed doors in countless American homes, Navy veterans were struggling in ways that their families could not understand and that their doctors were not equipped to treat. Nightmares. Flashbacks. Explosive anger. Emotional numbness. Inability to connect with their children. Alcohol and substance abuse. Divorce. Depression. Suicide. The cultural expectation was silence. Men who had served in the Navy were supposed to be tough. Strong. Stoic. Talking about your feelings, especially about something as shameful as being psychologically damaged by combat, was simply not done. The phrase "just get over it" captured the collective attitude perfectly. The Veterans Administration, which later became the Department of Veterans Affairs, existed to provide care for returning veterans. But its mental health resources were dramatically underfunded and understaffed. And the treatments that did exist were often deeply inadequate. Electroconvulsive therapy, which many people know as electroshock treatment, was used on some veterans with psychological conditions. Lobotomies were performed. Insulin coma therapy. The psychiatric toolbox of the era looks horrifying from our modern perspective. And for the men subjected to these treatments, the experience was often more traumatic than helpful. Meanwhile, a generation of Navy veterans was essentially living with untreated trauma for decades. Growing old with it. Dying with it. Never having had anyone sit down with them and say, "What happened to you was real. What you are feeling is real. You deserve help." That silence has its own weight. Its own cost. And it shaped the men who came home, and through them, it shaped their families, for generations. Korea came. The so-called Forgotten War. From 1950 to 1953, American naval forces were heavily engaged in another brutal conflict. And the psychiatric lessons of the Second World War were only partially applied. Navy psychiatrists in Korea did continue to practice forward treatment, trying to keep men close to the action and return them to duty quickly. The thinking was still largely focused on the operational imperative, getting sailors back into the fight, rather than on the long-term well-being of the individual. There was progress, though. The classification of psychiatric conditions was becoming more systematic. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, was first published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. It included a category called gross stress reaction, which recognized that extreme external events could produce lasting psychological disturbance. This was a step forward. A small step, but a real one. Korean War veterans came home to even less recognition than their Second World War counterparts. The war itself was underreported, politically complicated, and ultimately ended without a clear victory. The cultural appetite for celebrating these veterans simply was not there. And so they, too, largely suffered in silence. Then came Vietnam. And Vietnam changed everything. The Vietnam War was, in almost every measurable way, the most psychologically damaging conflict that American military personnel had experienced up to that point. The combination of factors was devastating. Guerrilla warfare with no clear front lines. An enemy who was often indistinguishable from the civilian population. Extreme heat, jungle conditions, disease, and exhaustion. The political controversy at home that meant returning veterans were often not welcomed, and in some cases were actively reviled. The draft system that meant men had little choice about whether to serve. For United States Navy personnel in Vietnam, the experiences were uniquely harrowing. Swift boat crews operating in the inland waterways of the Mekong Delta were in constant danger of ambush. Carrier pilots flew mission after mission over heavily defended targets in North Vietnam. Prisoners of war, many of them Navy aviators, endured years of brutal captivity and torture in North Vietnamese prisons. And when they came home, the country was fractured. Anti-war sentiment was high. There were no ticker tape parades. There was hostility. There was indifference. There was the Veterans Administration, overwhelmed and under-resourced. And there was something else. A group of Vietnam veterans who refused to be silent. This is one of the most important turning points in the entire history of how America deals with combat trauma. A group of Vietnam veterans, many of them Navy veterans, began organizing. They began talking publicly about what they had experienced. They began demanding recognition and treatment. They worked with psychiatrists, particularly a man named Haim Shatan and a researcher named Robert J. Lifton, to document and articulate what they were experiencing. The term post-Vietnam syndrome began to appear in clinical literature. And the evidence that combat trauma produced lasting, diagnosable, treatable psychological conditions was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1980, something extraordinary happened. The American Psychiatric Association published the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. And for the first time, it included a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD. This was a revolution. Not because the condition was new. Sailors have been experiencing it since the first naval battle in human history. But now it had a name. It had diagnostic criteria. It had a framework for treatment. And crucially, it shifted the paradigm from this as a character flaw to this as an injury that happened to you because of what you experienced. The naming of PTSD in 1980 was the result of a decades-long struggle by veterans, mental health professionals, and advocates. And its impact on how the United States Navy approached mental health care cannot be overstated. But recognition and effective care are two different things. And the story of the Navy's response to PTSD in the years following 1980 is complex, uneven, and sometimes deeply frustrating. On the positive side, there was genuine institutional movement. The Navy began developing specialized training for mental health professionals in recognizing and treating combat-related PTSD. The naval hospital system expanded its psychiatric capabilities. Programs were developed for returning veterans that included formal psychological screening. There was also growing research. The National Center for PTSD was established by Congress in 1989, with a mandate to study the condition and develop effective treatments. Navy and military-affiliated researchers contributed significant findings to the growing body of knowledge about how trauma affects the brain and body. The treatments being developed were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. Cognitive behavioral therapy emerged as a powerful approach to helping trauma survivors process their experiences. Prolonged exposure therapy, developed by Edna FOA, was showing remarkable results with combat veterans. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, known as EMDR, was gaining evidence as an effective trauma treatment. But there was also resistance. Deep, stubborn, institutional resistance. The military culture that equated toughness with silence had not disappeared. It had simply gone underground. Sailors who sought mental health treatment faced very real risks to their careers. The fear was widespread that if you admitted to having psychological problems, you would lose your security clearance. You would be passed over for promotion. You would be seen as unreliable. As a liability. This was not paranoia. This was, for many, the actual reality. And it meant that countless Navy personnel suffered in silence rather than seek the help they needed and deserved. The concept of stigma, the social shame attached to mental health conditions, was a massive barrier. And it was a barrier that the Navy, for all its institutional advances, was still struggling to address in any meaningful way. The Gulf War of 1990 and 1991 brought new challenges and new complexities. Navy sailors participated extensively in the coalition campaign to liberate Kuwait. And in the aftermath of the war, a strange and troubling phenomenon emerged. Large numbers of Gulf War veterans began reporting persistent health problems that could not be clearly attributed to any specific physical cause. Fatigue, cognitive problems, pain. A range of symptoms that came to be known collectively as Gulf War Syndrome. The debate about Gulf War Syndrome was contentious and, at times, ugly. Some officials initially dismissed the symptoms as psychosomatic. Veterans felt disbelieved and abandoned. Research eventually identified a range of potential contributing factors, including exposure to chemical agents, pesticides, and the psychological effects of combat. What Gulf War Syndrome illustrated, among other things, was the complexity of how trauma and environmental stress interact in ways that are not always easy to understand or treat. And it demonstrated once again that the military's first instinct was often to minimize and deny rather than to investigate and treat. But the Gulf War also coincided with an era of growing public awareness about PTSD. Movies, books, journalism. All were bringing the realities of combat trauma into the mainstream. And the pressure on military institutions to respond was growing. And then September 11, 2001 happened. And everything changed again. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that followed the attacks were, for the United States military, the longest sustained combat operations in American history. Navy personnel were deployed in ways and numbers that had not been seen since Vietnam. Carrier groups operating in the Persian Gulf. SEAL teams conducting raids deep into enemy territory. Sailors assigned to ground combat roles they had never historically occupied. The psychological toll was enormous. Multiple deployments. Extended time away from families. Combat experiences that were intense and deeply traumatic. And an enemy that was often invisible, making every interaction with the civilian population a potential life or death situation. The rate of PTSD diagnoses among returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan was alarming. Studies suggested that anywhere from 11 to 20% of veterans from these conflicts were experiencing significant PTSD symptoms. For the Navy, as for all the military services, this was a crisis. And this time, the institutional response was different. Not perfect. Not always consistent. But meaningfully different from what had come before. The Navy, along with the rest of the Department of Defense, began investing in mental health resources at a level that had never been seen before. The number of mental health professionals embedded with units was increased. Psychological health programs were developed specifically for service members and their families. Mandatory mental health screenings became part of the post-deployment process. There were also significant public awareness campaigns within the Navy aimed at reducing the stigma around seeking mental health care. Leadership, from the highest levels, began publicly stating that seeking help for psychological problems was a sign of strength, not weakness. That it was no different from seeking treatment for a broken arm. Was this enough? Was it effective? The answer is complicated. Let us talk about the specific treatments that were being used and developed during this era, because this is where the scientific story becomes genuinely remarkable. Prolonged exposure therapy became one of the primary evidence-based treatments for PTSD in military populations. The approach involves having the patient repeatedly revisit the traumatic memory in a controlled therapeutic setting, processing it until it loses its overwhelming power. The results in clinical trials were striking. Many veterans who had been living with severe PTSD for years showed significant improvement after completing a course of prolonged exposure therapy. Cognitive processing therapy, developed by Patricia Rees-Sick, was another evidence-based approach that gained wide use in military settings. It focuses on helping patients identify and challenge the distorted thoughts and beliefs that often develop after trauma. The belief that you are permanently broken. That the world is entirely dangerous. That you are somehow responsible for what happened to you. CPT helps patients examine these beliefs critically and replace them with more accurate understandings. EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, continued to accumulate evidence as an effective treatment. The therapy uses bilateral stimulation, often in the form of eye movements following the therapist's finger, while the patient focuses on traumatic memories. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the results have been consistently positive in clinical trials. Medication also played an increasing role. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, commonly known as SSRIs, were found to reduce some of the core symptoms of PTSD. Prazosin, originally developed as a blood pressure medication, was discovered to be effective in reducing trauma-related nightmares. For many veterans, medication combined with psychotherapy produced the best outcomes. And then there were the emerging therapies. Virtual reality exposure therapy, which allowed veterans to engage with simulated combat environments in a controlled therapeutic context. Stellate ganglion blocks, a nerve block procedure that some researchers believe can reduce PTSD symptoms. Transcranial magnetic stimulation. Mindfulness-based stress reduction. The science was moving faster than it ever had before. And the Navy was, for the first time in its history, genuinely trying to apply that science to help its people. But we cannot talk about this era without talking about the crisis that was happening alongside all of this progress. The veteran suicide epidemic. The statistics are devastating. Veterans and active duty military personnel have been dying by suicide at rates significantly higher than the general population. For the Navy specifically, the numbers have been deeply troubling. Young sailors, many of them with no combat experience at all, have been dying at alarming rates. What became increasingly clear to researchers and clinicians was that PTSD was just one part of a much larger picture of military mental health. Moral injury, the damage done to a person's moral foundation by participating in or witnessing acts that violate their deeply held values, was recognized as a distinct and serious condition. Traumatic brain injury, which could occur from blast exposure or other combat-related causes, was found to interact with and worsen PTSD symptoms. Military sexual trauma was another massive and deeply underaddressed issue. The rates of sexual assault and harassment within the military, including the Navy, were and continue to be appalling. And the psychological damage done to survivors, combined with the frequent failure of the institutional system to hold perpetrators accountable, produced its own epidemic of trauma. The Navy's response to military sexual trauma has been criticized extensively and justifiably. There have been policy changes and awareness campaigns. But the fundamental cultural problem has proven extraordinarily resistant to change. Let us also talk about something that rarely gets discussed in these conversations. The families. When a sailor comes home carrying PTSD, they do not carry it alone. It spreads through the household like smoke. Partners who do not understand why the person they love has become distant, angry, or emotionally unavailable. Children who are afraid of their own parents' rages or who walk on eggshells to avoid triggering them. Family systems that bend and often break under the weight of unaddressed trauma. The secondary traumatization experienced by military families is itself a serious mental health issue. And for much of American military history, these families received essentially no support at all. The Navy family support programs that have been developed in recent decades represent real progress. Family counseling. Deployment support groups. Resources for children of service members dealing with the psychological effects of their parents' service. These are meaningful developments. But they are still not enough. The gap between what military families need and what they actually receive remains very large. Now let us look at some of the specific programs and institutions that the Navy has developed to address combat trauma. Because buried in the difficult statistics and the historical failures, there are genuine examples of innovation and compassion that deserve to be acknowledged. The Naval Medical Center San Diego has been a significant center for military mental health research and treatment. The work done there on trauma and resilience has contributed meaningfully to the field. Naval hospital systems throughout the country have developed specialized PTSD programs that incorporate the latest evidence-based treatments. The Defense Centers of Excellence for Psychological Health and Traumatic Brain Injury, established in 2007, represented a major institutional commitment to taking military mental health seriously. It brought together researchers and clinicians from across the military services to share knowledge and develop best practices. The Real Warriors campaign, launched by the Department of Defense, used media and outreach to reduce stigma around mental health care in military communities. It featured real service members sharing their experiences with PTSD and treatment. The impact on military culture, while difficult to measure precisely, was real. The Navy also invested in peer support programs, recognizing that sailors were often more willing to talk to a fellow sailor who had been through similar experiences than to a mental health professional. Peer support specialists, trained to recognize signs of psychological distress and to connect their colleagues with resources, have been embedded in units throughout the Navy. The SEALs. The Special Operations Community. We cannot have this conversation without acknowledging the unique mental health situation faced by the Navy's special warfare personnel. SEAL teams have been deployed at an extraordinary pace since 2001. Multiple combat deployments. High-intensity operations. Constant pressure and danger. The culture of the Special Operations community, with its extreme emphasis on toughness and its deep suspicion of any perceived weakness, created particularly powerful barriers to mental health care. The suicide rate among Special Operations veterans is particularly alarming. And the response from the community has been complicated. There is genuine acknowledgement that something needs to change. There are programs being developed specifically for Special Operations personnel and their families. The Warrior Angel Foundation, the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, and other organizations are doing important work. But there is also profound resistance. The identity of the Special Operations Warrior is bound up with the idea of being superhuman. Of being beyond the normal limits that constrain ordinary people. Acknowledging psychological vulnerability feels, to many in this community, like a fundamental betrayal of that identity. The reckoning is ongoing. And it is urgent. Let us talk about something that has been revolutionizing our understanding of trauma at a biological level. Because the science of what PTSD actually does to the human brain and body is extraordinary, and it changes everything about how we think about treatment and recovery. Research using brain imaging technology has shown that PTSD is associated with real, measurable changes in brain structure and function. The amygdala, which processes fear responses, becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, which regulates emotional responses, becomes less active. The hippocampus, which is involved in memory processing, can actually shrink in size. In other words, PTSD is not just a psychological condition in some abstract sense. It is a physical change to the brain. The trauma literally rewires the neural pathways. And this understanding has profound implications for treatment. Researchers like Bessel van der Kolk, whose book The Body Keeps the Score became an unexpected bestseller and introduced millions of people to the latest science of trauma, have shown that trauma is stored in the body in ways that cannot be reached through talk therapy alone. That effective treatment often needs to address the physical, somatic dimension of the trauma response. This has led to growing interest in body-based therapies like yoga, somatic experiencing, and other approaches that work directly with the physical manifestations of trauma. The Navy and military medicine more broadly have been slow to embrace these approaches, but the evidence is accumulating. The research on epigenetics has added another layer of complexity and wonder to the picture. There is growing evidence that the effects of trauma can be passed down through generations, changing how genes are expressed in the children and even grandchildren of trauma survivors. The implications of this for understanding the long-term cost of war are staggering. The past decade has seen a remarkable and somewhat unexpected development in trauma treatment. The research into psychedelic-assisted therapy. Studies at Johns Hopkins University, NYU, and other institutions have produced remarkable results using MDMA-assisted therapy for severe treatment-resistant PTSD. The results have been so striking that MDMA-assisted therapy received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA, accelerating its path through the approval process. There is also significant research on psilocybin, the active compound in so-called magic mushrooms, as a potential treatment for PTSD and depression in veterans. Ketamine therapy has been approved for depression and is being studied for PTSD. These developments have created an interesting moment in military mental health. The very substances that were part of the counterculture that many military veterans of the Vietnam era associated with anti-war protesters are now being investigated as potential treatments for the psychological wounds of combat. The irony is not lost on many veterans. The response from the military establishment has been cautious, as you would expect. But the evidence is compelling enough that serious conversations are happening at every level, including within Navy medical circles, about how and whether to incorporate these approaches into standard care. We need to talk about the women. Because the history of mental health in the Navy is too often told as exclusively a story about men. Women have served in the United States Navy since the First World War, when the Navy enlisted women as yeomanettes to free men for sea duty. Since then, the role of women in the Navy has expanded dramatically. Today, women serve in virtually all roles, including combat roles aboard ships and submarines. And women veterans experience PTSD at higher rates than men. They face all of the challenges that male veterans face, plus additional ones. Military sexual trauma is disproportionately experienced by women. The mental health system within the military was largely designed with men in mind. And the cultural barriers to seeking help, while significant for everyone, have particular dimensions for women who are often navigating a male-dominated institutional culture. The stories of women Navy veterans who have struggled with PTSD, who have navigated a system that was not always designed for them, who have advocated for themselves and for others, are an essential part of this history. And they have been too often overlooked. Now let us look forward. Because the story is not over. In many ways, the most important chapters are still being written. The Navy today is operating in a mental health environment that is more sophisticated and more compassionate than anything that existed at any previous point in its history. The resources available to sailors experiencing psychological distress are greater than ever before. The stigma, while still real and still damaging, is not as absolute as it once was. The science of trauma treatment has advanced to a degree that would have seemed miraculous to the Navy psychiatrists of the Second World War. And yet, the challenges remain enormous. The rate of veteran suicide is still too high. The gap between the need for mental health care and the availability of qualified providers is still too large. The cultural barriers to seeking help are still powerful. Military sexual trauma continues to cause devastating harm. The transition from military to civilian life remains psychologically dangerous for many veterans. The research is pointing toward a future that holds genuine promise. Genetic research may allow us to identify which individuals are most at risk for developing PTSD after trauma exposure, allowing for targeted prevention efforts. Neurofeedback and other brain-based therapies may offer new pathways to healing for those who have not responded to current treatments. Telehealth has dramatically expanded access to mental health care for veterans in rural areas or other situations where in-person care is difficult to access. The conversations around mental health within the Navy are different today than they were even 10 years ago. Young sailors are talking about mental health in ways that previous generations simply would not have. The language has changed. The culture, slowly, painfully slowly, is changing. Let us close by returning to the beginning. To the individual human being at the center of all of this. The sailor who came back from Guadalcanal and could not sleep for 30 years. The Vietnam-era Navy pilot who self-medicated with alcohol because there was nowhere to turn. The Gulf War veteran whose strange symptoms were dismissed and denied. The Iraq War sailor who lost 2 friends to improvised explosive devices and never got to talk to anyone about what that did to him. These are not abstractions. These are not statistics. These are human beings. Americans who gave their time, their health, their psychological wholeness in service of their country. And the question that runs through the entire history we have been tracing is this. Did the country, did the institution, did the Navy, take care of them the way they deserve to be taken care of? The honest answer is no. Not adequately. Not consistently. Not with the urgency and compassion that the scale of the suffering demanded. But the other honest answer is that it is getting better. That the distance between where the Navy was in 1862, when soldiers with psychological trauma were simply told to get over it, and where the Navy is today, with evidence-based treatment programs and mental health professionals embedded in units, is enormous. The direction of travel, for all the setbacks and failures and frustrations, is toward greater care. Greater understanding. Greater compassion. And every step of that journey has been taken because someone refused to be silent. A veteran who told their story. A psychiatrist who fought for their patients. A family member who demanded answers. A researcher who dedicated their career to understanding what war does to the human mind. A sailor who reached out for help even when every instinct told them not to. The history of mental health at sea is ultimately a history of human beings insisting on the value of human beings. Insisting that the wounds that cannot be seen are just as real as the wounds that can. Insisting that the people who sacrifice everything in service of their nation deserve to come home whole. That fight is not over. It will never be entirely over. But it is being fought. And that matters. To every Navy veteran who has ever carried the invisible weight of combat trauma, to every sailor who ever woke up at 3 in the morning fighting a war that was supposed to be over, to every family that has loved someone through the darkness of PTSD. Your struggle has not been in vain. Your story is part of this story. And this story is still being written. Thank you for your service. And thank you for your survival.